Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, we're here with Carleton University's Professor Steve Saideman, and given the incident that happened at the Polish border this week and all of the talk about what this means about NATO and Article 5, I figured we would get our NATO expert to walk us through what really this means, and yeah, just I guess maybe offer some reassurance. Steve.
Sure. It's funny because about a month ago now, I was interviewed by CBC Kids about the threat of nuclear war. So I'm always like, I assure the kids that nuclear war is not going to happen. So it's still not going to happen.
All right.
Uh, I think, of course, any time where there's any violence that crosses into a NATO country, that raises hackles and concerns. But it's not the first time a NATO country has been struck by an adjacent war. Turkey was struck multiple times during the Syrian conflict. They often would say, "Hey, can we have an Article 4 meeting?" And the rest of NATO would be like, "No, don't worry about it." And so the big thing is Article 5 is the agreement that an attack upon one is equal to attack upon all. But there's a
Yeah.
couple of things that are required in that. First of all, it's not just one country says an attack has happened and suddenly Article 5 is invoked and everybody runs to the barricades. It's the alliance has to agree that an attack has happened, that it is worthy of an Article 5 response. That's step one. Step two then is figuring out what the response is. And step three is then whoever decides to join in can join in, but there's no obligation for everybody to do what they're supposed to do, what the plan is. And with anything like this, where it's a small little thing, it would be reluctant in any condition. And again, ask Turkey about that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, when it comes to should we declare Article 5 against the Russians, that's a whole other kettle of fish. It's tantamount to declaring war,
Yeah.
essentially. And we've been trying so hard not to be at war with Russia because that does pose tremendous risk of nuclear war. So that's part of it. Part of it is the alliance would, in any situation, consensus is hard to get. It'd be hard to imagine the Germans, the French, and the Italians all agreeing, for instance, to go to war anywhere, but particularly over Poland or the Baltics for something that is small scale.
Okay. So it sounds almost like there is a mechanism built in that cooler heads can prevail.
And that's what we saw, right? I mean, we saw the United States continues its winning streak of having quick intelligence that turns out to be true. So the United States is rebounding from its 2003 Iraq shenanigans. So at the beginning of this war, Biden spent the months before the war releasing real intelligence saying this war is going to happen. Everybody's like, no, it's not going to happen. And then quickly the United States said, the trajectory was not from Russia. And everybody's like, that's interesting. And the alliance itself was like, okay, we're going to talk. And it was just so happened that the leadership of NATO was mostly in Bali for the G20.
Yeah.
And so Biden pulled aside, had a special meeting where he pulled aside the leaders of the NATO countries, particularly the G7 ones, to talk about it. But they didn't come out of it, blasting Russia about their aggression for this moment of aggression. They've been blasting Russia for its overall pattern of aggression. And that allowed them to, say, well, we're going to look into this. We'll figure it out. Meanwhile, there was some thought to invoking Article 4, which is a clause of the treaty which says that any country that feels threatened can ask for consultations. And that would lead to them having a conversation about the threat. But that sort of got headed off by the news.
Mm-hmm.
I think that if it had continued to be the case that it was Russian missiles that hit Poland, you might have seen Article 4 invoked, but that has no consequences for the war itself. It just means we're taking this seriously. That it might lead to an Article 5 invocation, but not in this case.
All right. It's interesting because I never really hear about Article 4 until this last week, and everyone starts talking, well, this could be an Article 4 situation instead. So I think that's interesting to see that also that mechanism also exists within the alliance.
Yeah, it doesn't make news much because again, it's not as consequential, but it's come up several times, particularly when Turkey was involved in the larger Syrian conflict and got hit a few times by either Russian or Syrian artillery or aircraft or missiles. So it has come up, but it just doesn't get the same kind of attention because it's not the defining characteristic of the alliance, and it's not the thing that seems to be a trigger to war. Article 5 has only been invoked one time. That was in the aftermath of 9/11. And it was actually, the United States was kind of reluctant about it because it wasn't sure it wanted alliance help dealing with Afghanistan because that was led by the Bush administration, which was very anti-multilateralism. It was also a couple years after the air campaign in Kosovo, which was seen where NATO negotiations was seen as being inconvenient and painful and awkward. And one of the books about it was called Winning Ugly. It was a three-month bombing campaign. It didn't require much, but it was perceived to be very difficult.
All right. What do we suppose the consequences for this incident are going to be in terms of the response from NATO, in terms of what might happen now?
Well, I think if we would have seen more stronger response had the original story stayed in place, that was Russian missiles. So I think for some countries, it gives them an excuse to go, well, nothing's really changed. I do think something really has changed, which is the Russians have engaged in a more systematic assault on civilian targets and particularly energy infrastructure. And they, up until now, had been pretty careful about not hitting close to the borders of Ukraine. And now they seem to be much more willing to do so. So that suggests the Russians are willing to accept more risk. Which means on our side, we need to watch to see whether the Russians realize, oh, my goodness, we came pretty close to something that could have gotten bad. Maybe we shouldn't do this or not. That's right. Step one. And step two is you're already seeing, I think a lot of the announcements that were already in play are now going to be recalibrated or marketed as being in reaction to this. So Canada was already willing to give yet more assistance to the Ukrainians. There's a very large Ukrainian delegation, for instance, at the Halifax International Security Forum, which is happening this weekend, exactly at this moment that we're talking on Saturday, the 19th of November. And so Ukraine obviously figures in a big way in Canadian foreign policy, mostly for domestic, well, not mostly, but partly for domestic political reasons, but also because this is the NATO show of the day. And that's where we do best, is where we fit in. We are awkward when we're in Asia, but we're pretty smooth when we're in Europe, generally. And so we're rolling out new stuff. Most of our allies are rolling out new stuff. There's whatever reinforcements that were going to happen in the Baltics and Poland and Romania and other neighboring countries that will be defined as being in response to this, in part, but a lot of those things are already in motion, but they may end up being bigger as a result of this. And you may see the Ukrainians get more anti-aircraft capability. But I think that's probably in as much a reaction or more reaction to the Russian air campaign, which has been so devastating.
Right. This notion about certain NATO countries giving old fighter jets to Ukraine has kind of reared its head again the last few days.
Yeah, well, one of the ways to shoot down cruise missiles is to shoot them down not by land-based anti-missile systems, but by fighter planes. And I think a lot of the reluctance at the outset of giving fighter planes to Poland to Ukraine were for a couple of reasons. One is we weren't sure they'd survive very long. That is the planes. Because we had exaggerated ideas of how good the Russians were at anti-aircraft stuff. The second thing is we weren't sure the war was going to last that long. So, would it make sense to get them, to get them there, get them trained on it, all that kind of stuff. They have to, if they're Polish planes, for instance, you have to rip out the sort of the super NATO secret stuff that's in the planes. to make them compatible with the rest of NATO. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, so it just can't give NATO, super high technology, secret technology to the Ukrainians. So you have to deal with
Yeah.
that. But now that the war is known to be lasting longer and is going to last beyond, the winter, it makes more sense to invest and give them more complicated equipment that takes time to get set up, gets to take time to get the training and the maintenance stuff set up. Because the hard part about flying planes or driving tanks is not the flying or the driving, it's the maintaining.
Yeah.
And that requires training, it requires spare parts, it requires a lot of stuff. And we, Canada, the Germans in particular, other countries, including the United States, have a hard time keeping up the stuff that they've got. And then, we're countries who are not at war. We're not, nobody's taking away our infrastructure while we're doing this. And we still have a hard time keeping our stuff working. And so it's, do we give weapon systems to the Ukrainians so that are multi-million-dollar planes or tanks that are essentially toss-aways? Javelins made a lot of sense because that literally is a toss-away thing. Okay, you take a bazooka over your shoulder, you use it, and you take out a tank, and if it breaks, you get another javelin. It's not a huge deal.
Yeah.
But it's very different with tanks where, oh crap, we've busted the engine or something. How do we get the parts? How do we, all that sort of stuff. So I expect, because this war now is going to last much longer than people originally expected, you're going to see everybody being pushed to do more or to give more. And we may not have that many more artillery shells to give, but we may have more vehicles, more armored vehicles to give.
Yeah.
And that's particularly true for the United States, which has lots of armored vehicles. And then the question is, do we want to train them on F-16s or A-10s or other kinds of aircraft? But again, any kind of new aircraft means an entirely new line of supply of spare parts, because the parts for one plane don't work for another plane, all that kind of stuff.
Right. And I guess my last question is just, there was a news story this week about the Canadian commander in Latvia basically saying if Russia tried to cross, we'd rout them. So I just wanted to get your take on that.
Well, there's two parts to that story, right? One or three parts to that story. The first part is the Russians have proven to be not nearly as capable as we thought. And so if they perform as well in assaulting Latvia as they did in assaulting Ukraine, they wouldn't be as hard to defeat, to stop.
Right.
The second is that a lot of the Russian capability in that neighborhood is no longer there because it's being chewed up in Ukraine. This war is going to set back the Russian military a decade or two or more, because they've lost hundreds, if not thousands, of armored vehicles. They've lost an entire generation of military leadership, which might be a good thing given how bad it was. They've lost so much and they've been having to strip, equipment and personnel from other parts of the greater Russia space. And so my guess is that the commander in Latvia is looking across the border and seeing fewer guys on the other side, or younger or much older guys on the other side, these mobilized draftees that have no training. And so their opponent is much weaker now than it was a year ago. And it's demonstrated that whatever it was a year ago is much less than we thought it was. So that's the second thing. The third thing is we're reinforcing. I mean, I saw in today's paper that we had 700 troops in Latvia. Well, the last time I checked, we had something like 400 or 500. So all these deployments by NATO have increased in size. So we have more troops on our side of the border. They probably have less troops on their side in Latvia. And so what used to be a speed bump is now maybe a pretty effective force for stopping, at least at the outset, any invasion. But routing, well, the Russians are self-routing, so maybe that speaking to that. But it's, the thing is, we know how badly the Russians are at this because we've seen it over the past year. We don't know how good we are. We don't know how good we are because we haven't done this since 2003 as the United States, as a multilateral coalition engaged in war fighting, 1991-ish. And guess what? Canada didn't do any of that. In 1981, we were not on the the ground in the desert doing the fighting. Yeah. So, we have something like 10 countries in our sector. And I've said before that because we were late to the game, we got the least capable allies, the ones with least experience, the ones with most restrictions, at least as they, on what they can do, at least in terms of what they did in Afghanistan. I mean, Italy and Spain were not, and Hungary were not, sorry, not Hungary, Italy and Spain were not known as being the most assertive countries in Afghanistan with the best military capability. And with they were known as having pretty restrictive rules of engagement. Now that's probably less important in a defensive war in the Baltics, but we're putting together 10 countries together to fight, to fight as one. That's why they've been training for the past 3 years or if not 3 years, past 8 years, essentially 7 years, how long this has been going on. So they're not bad at it, but they're not really tested. The only thing that tests you is war. And then you know whether everything you've done in practice works. And so we don't know. We don't want to know. We don't want to find out. But we found, there's that phrase about doing stuff and finding out. And the Russians have done that, and they have found out that they are limited. But I don't want us to say. I think our military is actually quite capable, and I think our allies' militaries are quite capable. And particularly once you throw in our air power, I think we can do a pretty good job. But we're learning lessons from the Ukrainians. Like, okay, your headquarters better not have lots of electronic emissions because somebody's going to find it and zap it. And that's what the Ukrainians have been doing to the Russians. But the Russians can do that to us. And as far as I've been told from our military folks, is that our discipline over that is, at least a year ago, wasn't particularly good. Maybe it's better now, but we could have headquarters that get hit by Russian artillery and suddenly we lose our command staff. So I wouldn't get too cocky, but I would say that the relative balance